What is that equivalent fear in a guy? It's that they end up raising a child and then finding out it's not theirs. Hi, Jeff Marsachi, the Plain English Attorney, and we've got an interesting one today that's likely to raise a lot of emotions, and it's on paternity tests in estate planning and planning proactively to avoid issues in divorce. And this really has kind of become a big thing, even with a bill being introduced in the state of Tennessee that's going to make it mandatory to have paternity tests for any unmarried pregnancy before a man is allowed to put his name on the birth certificate. And everybody's kind of up in arms and they're all emotional, and there seems to be an awful lot of disinformation going on out there about these particular paternity tests because they're making it sound like paternity tests for everybody. No, it's just these specific instances. If it's an unmarried woman and a man wants to put his name on the birth certificate, or she wants him to sign the birth certificate, they're going to require that paternity test. Well, why? What's the big issue here? It's because there are a lot of potential cases of paternity fraud. And this is really stemming in that specific bill in Tennessee from an instance that one of the members of the House had heard from a constituent about how his girlfriend was pregnant and gave birth, and then he later petitioned to be acknowledged as the father, and then the relationship went sour, and now she's looking for child support. And then he decides to get a paternity test and realizes, oh my gosh, this kid isn't mine. So what, oh my, I shouldn't have to pay. Well, dude, why did you go and seek to be put on the not the birth certificate, but to be acknowledged as the legal father without a paternity test? Yeah, you're going to be caught paying for child support for a kid that isn't yours if you're going to take on that fatherly role and even legally be acknowledged as the father. If you think it's important for educational videos like this to get out there, then please help us out by subscribing to the channel. All right, so this is what Tennessee's trying to cut off with this bill. And again, at the time this is being recorded, it's just a proposed bill. Today is September 20th, 2023. Just yesterday, when doing some research for this, I checked. The bill was introduced back in 2022. Haven't seen any progress, but I guess it's starting to get some traction in the news, but the legislation hasn't even gotten traction yet. So this is a big issue, but it becomes very much a personal issue with specific cases for individuals, but it's not becoming this huge widespread thing just yet, but it will. So do you really want to end up waiting on the law to change, or do you want to look at what can you do proactively to make sure that if a girlfriend, a spouse has a child, that it's absolutely yours, but you also want to do it in a way that's not going to cause a huge amount of friction. So let me go ahead and ask you this one question about a paternity test. And we've got these two options. Which is the best option for trying to get a paternity test? Your pregnant girlfriend or spouse, a few months before giving birth, you're going to go up to them and say, hey, I want a paternity test. Or if they say, hey, I'm pregnant, great, I want a paternity test. Oh my gosh, the meltdown that's going to happen, and deservedly so. That's supposed to be a very happy time, and here you go, basically saying, I'm not sure this kid is mine. Okay, here's the second option. When you end up getting into an exclusive relationship, you end up saying, look, here's a couple of things that are going to be important before we get into this exclusive relationship. It's a requirement of mine that if we end up moving in together, there's going to be a cohabitation agreement. If we're going to get married, there's going to be a premarital agreement. And in those agreements, we are specifically going to say, hey, if there are any kids born, that there's going to be paternity tests. This is the way it is. If you can't handle that, then, okay, maybe we shouldn't be any more than just in a situationship. All right. Another piece of this, and if you check out YouTube and other channels that focus on some of this stuff, as a guy, you really shouldn't ever be asking for an exclusive relationship with a woman. They should be coming to you because then you know that's what they're looking for. And if so, you get to lay out, all right, here are my requirements. Here's hard stop. These are the boundaries and things that are not negotiable for me. And if you want to get into that relationship with me, then these are the things that are going to be required. And you don't have to be ridiculous about it, but saying these couple of things. Hey, I'm not, I'm a guy who's on my purpose. I'm trying to build wealth, build business, build my life. I would love for you to be a part of it, but these are the things: cohabitation agreement, premarital agreement, and paternity tests have to be part of that if we're going to have kids. And if they don't want it, or okay, fine. You have to be willing to walk away. So given those two situations, they're already pregnant. They're announcing they're pregnant. They're a couple of months away from birth. And you go, yeah, I want a paternity test. Yeah, you do look like a jerk. If it's when you're just starting to get into this relationship and she wants to take it to be an exclusive relationship and you lay out, here are those things, it's much more receptive and it's not that emotional compared to the other situation of there's already a pregnancy. So you can look at these things and work them out ahead of time. Now, what exactly are the statistics that are out there about paternity fraud? Some of these same channels that I'm talking about, they're going to throw this number out of 30% of people who think they're the father aren't. No. That's a load of crap. Here's what it actually is using actual statistics that have been curated by the National Institute of Health. So this is a government agency that looks through these things. They have a pretty broad range. It's about 0.8% up to 30%. And again, that's the range that they're getting, but the median that they've gone through with the statistics is about 3.7%. So, all right, 4%. You may have heard, whoa, wait a minute. I heard about this study that says it's 30%. Well, no. This Canadian study from decades ago that was really being bandied about is 10 to 30%. That high end of 30 was very, very specific. And it was if the father suspects that they aren't actually the biological father, then it's 30%. So it's not a set of all men. It's a set of just the ones who believe that there might have been cheating and that the kid may not be theirs. Now, and this is now more anecdotal. There's an attorney named Marilyn York. I suggest if you want to go ahead, check her out on YouTube. She's a female divorce attorney that works for men in divorce. And she's got some really good, pretty funny commercials out there. And it's good. But she also did a good TED Talk that talks about fatherhood and in the context of divorce. And she was saying that among the hundreds of men that she represented as a divorce attorney, I think at that time of the TED Talk, there were only a couple of instances. I think she said two, but really it's just a handful of instances out of all those hundreds that the father was wrong when he thought he was either the father or not the father. She was talking about that there is this connection that the fathers will feel with their actual biological children, or they'll kind of know it's not. In her practice, it's only a few times that the father was wrong. It's like, that's not my kid. No, paternity test says it is. Or, that is definitely my kid, but we're going to do a paternity test anyway. No, it's not your kid. It was only a couple of instances when the father did not know. So that suspicion, if it's a genuine suspicion, they know in their gut, hey, there might be they're probably right. Well, from the statistics, there's that 30%, but just in this divorce case, it was only a handful of times. All right, so when you're looking at these paternity tests, what are the objections that are out there? And this is societal as well as, specifically from the woman that you're asking for the paternity test. Again, societal or just the women. Don't you trust me? Okay, this is kind of the same thing that I've seen with premarital agreements. And just to go ahead and talk about the book that I have out there, the divorce firewall strategy. We do talk a lot about premarital agreements and how those premarital agreements do have some objections to them. It's, well, wait a minute, don't you trust me? Well, wait a minute, things change. So the thing with a premarital agreement is, well, don't you trust us? Because if we're putting together this premarital agreement, it's going to list what we're committing to. So either we're going to stick to it or not. If you don't intend to stick to this premarital agreement, and you don't intend for the marriage to keep going, and you would rather have the state decide what happens to our relationship rather than us, then maybe we shouldn't be getting together. The premarital agreement only goes over what you're agreeing to. Just saying, no, how insulting, just like the paternity test. This is insulting. How dare you? Well, wait a minute. The whole don't you trust me thing, trust but verify. Put it in writing. And then there is that indignation. How dare you clutch the pearls? It's insulting. How dare you ask me for this? Well, again, timing may be a big factor in all of this, and when you're bringing it up, which is why you want to make sure that you're bringing this up in the context of these cohabitation agreements or premarital agreements, when the situation is serious enough that you're at least moving in together. So, now there's also a big third objection, and this is also coming from a study from the National Institute of Health. Now, I'm going to read this out, and you're going to make it seem, in your mind, you're going to be thinking this is just a ridiculous thing. It's really kind of twisting things around in order to come to the conclusion they want, and I really do look at it that way. There is a stigma in even having a woman take a paternity test, because the same can't be said about a man. That a man isn't going to be, quote, accused of cheating by being forced to take a paternity test. So the women always know that the child is theirs, and therefore it's a very sexist and misogynistic thing for a woman to even be asked to take a paternity test, because that stigma can't also be put on the gut. Okay, here's exactly what the NIH said in this report. Two things. Although mandatory paternity testing would ostensibly clarify information about fathers, We argue that such a practice would unfairly police mothers' sexual and reproductive lives and may not provide meaningful information about a child's father. Okay? And in another piece of the report soon after, in positive/negative paternity testing, women's sexual practices will be exposed, identifying whether or not her social partner is the genetic father. Yet a social father's sexual practices are not explicitly exposed in paternity testing. As such, mandatory paternity testing makes women's sexual practices suspect and open to scrutiny in a way that her partner's sexual practices are not. This requires that we consider the mother's interests as separable from her social and/or reproductive partner. We argue that giving birth should not change a woman's status as a rights-bearing individual, especially in regards to sexual and reproductive privacy. Okay, but the father is going to end up paying 18 years of child support for a kid that isn't theirs if there isn't a paternity test. Now, there is this argument, and it makes a lot of sense, for just mandatory paternity testing at the time of birth, no matter what. Before a father can be on a birth certificate, there has to be mandatory paternity testing across the board, and that actually does make a lot of sense. It clears up who the actual biological father is, or if it's, at least if it's not the person who thinks they're the father, then they, one, don't have legal rights to that child at that point. Two, they do not have legal responsibility for the child at that point. And three, you're not stripping away the biological father's rights to be a father. Imagine that, yes, it's you can put whomever you want on the birth certificate and they can just sign that they're the father, and you stripped away the parental rights of another individual without their choice at all. The other thing is, knowing who the biological father is can greatly impact the medical treatment of that child throughout their life. If the biological father actually has some kind of genetic disorder and it's not regularly screened for, but now they know that he is the biological father, and the biological father says, whoa, wait a minute, I've got this that runs in my family, we need to genetically test for it. Now suddenly they can detect this very early, but leaving that child out there in ignorance of actually knowing who their father is puts their health at risk in a way that wouldn't be there if we knew for a fact, okay, this person who thinks they're the father isn't the father, it's someone else, and now we can find out who that is. So societally, people go crazy. It's like, how dare you? That's a very emotional response to this, but a logical response in a lot of cases, especially as the price of paternity testing, just the yes or no, goes down. It really should be mandatory across the board and paid for through health insurance as just a regular course of treatment from childbirth. It should just be included because it will clear up so many other potential health things, as well as legally clearing up whether the person who thinks they're the father is or not right from the get-go. And then we don't have these legal issues of someone having to fight paternity in court and saying, I shouldn't have to pay child support because they're not mine. And now we have all these legal complications. That just legally makes sense. Well, why isn't it that way? Well, it's because there's a significant enough number of children out there who are not biologically belonging to the people, to the men who are having to pay that child support. And it all could have been cleared up. And it's like, well, wait a minute. Then where are they going for this money? They're going to the government. That's actually a point that I do also make in my book. the divorce firewall strategy. I cover that as the real reason behind a lot of these government policies. And it's very, very easy for a lot of upset men, and in particular, and families to, oh, the law is just out to get men. They're out to get men and they're supporting women, but they're going after men. No, it's all about money. It's about who's going to pay, and the government doesn't want to pay if there is an alternative. So what do you end up doing? You've got ingrained in the law, not a prejudice against men, but trying to have government not pay if there's someone else who can. So this is where I talk about it in the book, how you can protect yourself to make sure that you're lining up your entire life, not just paternity, but with marriage, with premarital agreements, and what we'll talk about in a bit, a domestic asset protection trust in a way that secures your assets so it's fair, but it's negotiated between the spouses so that it's not going to end up being completely unfair, completely out of the blue, and probably most importantly, you're not relying on the state government determining what happens in your relationship. You're making these decisions yourself. Now, I suppose a lot of this, the quote indignation and the societal upset and upheaval about even suggesting paternity tests, it's really coming down to emotional reactions to fears. And the big fears that a lot of men have versus fears that women have really are different. For a lot of women, the big fear, the stuff that keeps them up at night or worries them in situations, is that they're not going to be cared for. So if they're getting into a relationship and it's like, whoa, I need to make sure that I'm being looked after, that I'm being taken care of, that I'm being protected. And that's legitimate. That's what their fear is, that they won't. And so with things like a prenup, oh my gosh, you're not going to take care of me. How dare you? Whoa, wait. A premarital agreement doesn't mean you're not taken care of. It simply means that you're laying out, here's what the deal is before you get into marriage. And if the idea is, okay, here you put into a premarital agreement, here's what the budget is, here's how we're going to approach expenses and things, here's how we're each going to save for our own retirement and our own security, and here's what we will put in together. That's 50-50, or here's how you're laying all of that out. So if you're going through and negotiating with each of you having your own attorney, here's what's in a premarital agreement, and here's how it's going to be. That whole, I'm not being cared for, well, you can walk away, or you can have put into the agreement addressing everybody's wishes to the point where you come to an agreement. The other big fear for women, and I have to use the code here, it's SA, meaning they're out there and there's some strange person that takes advantage in an illegal and forceful way. YouTube hates the actual word, so we're not going to say it. But okay, that's a fear. What is that equivalent fear in a guy? It's that they end up raising a child and then finding out it's not theirs. That uneasiness, that feeling in the pit of their stomach like it's a huge fear, that's kind of the equivalent for men. And so women wanting to feel protected, but also that SA deep, dark fear, the equivalent of the SA in men is that they're raising a child and paying for a child that ends up not being theirs. That's their fear. The equivalent on the not being cared for side for men, it's being cheated on, it's disloyalty. So men and women often look for different things, but around this issue of paternity, that really is a huge, huge fear for men, that they could end up raising a child that ends up not being theirs. So let's get to this issue of paternity itself. What's the best way to do it? Like I said at the very beginning, it's not, oh, honey, I'm pregnant. Great, let's have a paternity test. Or, okay, we're only a few months away from our bundle of joy being born. Yeah, about that. Let's get a paternity test. Very bad timing. All right, so let's look at paternity in two different facets. First is, guys, be proactive with relations, not relationships. So you know what I'm getting to. Again, trying to keep it YouTube friendly. Guys, always use your own protection until you're ready to actually have a child. Oh, well, she's got protection. No. Always rely on your protection. Always dispose of your own protection. When we're talking about that type of protection, there's been a rise of at least stories that are coming out, particularly for athletes, of women trying to have one night stands with guys. Okay, they take it, their protection, they throw it in a wastebasket, and they're trying to get it into themselves to get knocked up by a pro athlete. No. Always dispose of it yourself. Always know that what your partner's protection is as well. Don't rely on it, but know that it's happening, so that between what you're using for protection and they're using for protection, you know what's going on. Just go ahead and make sure that protection is being used, and make sure it's being used every single time until you are ready to be a parent. So, second phase is being proactive in relationships when we're talking about paternity. And this is where the discussion of paternity tests should really come into play. Now, like I mentioned, the first one is when you're getting into an exclusive relationship, preferably with her broaching the subject and you discussing it. Here are the requirements. If we're going to end up moving in together at some point, there's a cohabitation agreement. If we're getting married, there's a premarital agreement. And in all cases, there will be paternity tests. Putting a requirement for a paternity test into the cohabitation agreement should be mandatory, non-starter. This is one of those things that is absolutely positively, no matter what, going to be in here in a cohabitation agreement as well as a premarital agreement, so that the discussion is happening with everything else around the relationship. It's not one focused thing, and it's not at a, quote, socially inappropriate time, not an emotional time. It's all being laid out. And there was that advance notice when you got into the exclusive relationship to begin with. So, all right, let's talk just very quickly. What's the difference between a cohabitation agreement and a premarital agreement? Well, the cohabitation agreement says a lot of the same things that the premarital agreement will be, which is, okay, we're living together. Here are the things that I'm paying for. Here's the things they're paying for. Or here's what the percentage is going to the bills. And here's what the responsibilities are. And in a cohabitation agreement, you're specifically saying this is not to be construed as a marriage. This is simply romantic people, romantic partners living together, and everybody can call it off at any point. There's no palimony. There's no alimony. It's not marriage. Here's what we're doing. And really, you should be checking to see whether the state and jurisdiction and the locale you're in, whether it has palimony or common law marriage, and then maybe consider living somewhere else if you're going to do this, so that they don't force you into an agreement. So that's the cohabitation agreement. It's saying, hey, this isn't to be looked at as marriage. The premarital agreement is, okay, we are getting married, but Here's the separate property. Just you do the same thing with the cohabitation agreement. Here's what my separate property is. Here's what their separate property is. Here's how we're handling the bills. Here's how we're handling these other situations. And here's how we're handling the raising of children, as well as, again, paternity tests, just mandatory at the time of birth so that it's done. There isn't any kind of issue there. So this is still going to end up being almost exactly the same type of thing, the same exact type of testing, but it's in these two agreements looked at and negotiated. Now, again, I keep coming back to the book. I'm kind of a paperback person, but it's also available at Kindle, at least now at a very reduced price. So you might want to check it out. But when you're going through these agreements, that's the time to discuss all of it. But each of you have your own attorneys. It's almost as bad, not quite, but almost as bad saying, here's a cohabitation agreement, or here's a premarital agreement that I put together and you're going to sign it or we're not getting married. That's kind of duress that could get them out of the agreement. The best way to do it is don't shy away from the relationship items. Don't shy away from the discussions. Be rational over being emotional and discuss it in the context and framework of getting these agreements put together. So that's the time to talk about it. So then when the time comes for birth, it's not being sprung on anyone. And when you start with some of those prenatal visits, just discuss with the doctor, with your spouse or your partner in the room, okay, part of what we agreed to in our relationship is that there's going to be a paternity test at the time of birth. And that's it. And that you're not going to sign any kind of birth certificate until the results are there. And that's just the way you agreed to set up your relationship from the start. And so this is just carrying it through. If she starts flipping out at that point, then, all right, wait a minute. Then you absolutely need that paternity test because there's some nervousness going on there. All of the emotions about it should have been much, much less when initially discussed at the cohabitation agreement negotiations for paternity testing. And this is the other big thing. Never, ever, 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 ever sign a birth certificate without some kind of paternity test. This way you know for sure. All right, so what about the Domestic Asset Protection Trust? Now, I mentioned this. This is coordinated along with that premarital agreement and even that cohabitation agreement because you're keeping everything separate. So when you're keeping everything separate, part of what you should be doing is putting your excess money each month or even every other week, depending on when your paychecks are coming in. So according to your agreement, you're paying into whatever you're paying into. You're accumulating outside of the trust just what you need on a regular basis. So if you've got everything kind of adjusted, it's only for a couple of $1,000s for some additional expenses that might pop up. And everything else is going into the trust and being invested. Here's part of what you can discuss when you're talking about it. Because, again, most of the time, a big concern for women is that they're not being cared for. But in addition to that, oh my gosh, they want to make sure their children are cared for. So you can absolutely then assure them, if this is the way you put it into your domestic asset protection trust, my kids are going to be taken care of through that trust if I pass on. That's the estate piece of it. The kids are going to be cared for. You can also talk about and negotiate how she could be taken care of. And usually the way to do that is some type of insurance, or if you've built up a specific retirement account outside the trust, we can figure out a way to get you access to that as your safety net. But if you don't use all of that up, it's still going to the kids, but it's going to my kids. And so you're going to emphasize the paternity test is also to assure that the children that you have together are going to be those potential beneficiaries through the domestic asset protection trust. Now, the domestic asset protection trust is a whole other thing, and we're already kind of going a little bit long with this video. So you can go ahead and take a look in the divorce firewall strategy. It talks a lot more about that domestic asset protection trust. And we're still working on putting together a kind of full-blown course on that whole divorce firewall strategy so that it goes into even more depth than the book itself. But again, it's available on Amazon. It's available on Kindle. Just go to divorcefirewall.com and you can get into this a little bit more. So that's really a good kind of overview on paternity tests. When's a good time to bring them up? How to bring them up, how to legally incorporate these into documents to protect you, but also protect your kids through a good, solid strategy. So I hope you found that information useful. And as I always tell my clients, please stay safe, plan ahead, and enjoy life. And whatever you do, make it a great day.